Good evening. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of some of the major media in the United States here this evening. What's Left from Denver, Boulder's own Free Speech TV, Boulder's own Alternative Radio here, and C-SPAN, which is filming the evening for broadcast. So we want to, cut to the quick, get to the main event, 15 rounds, Bob McChesney versus the corporate media.
Heavyweight division.
Heavyweight division. This is an acorn, if those of you can't see it, and I thought it was a nice little prop to have to kind of demonstrate what Left Hand has meant and how it has grown from a seedling, from an acorn, into this mighty oak of a bookstore. By the way, this mighty oak of a bookstore could not accommodate more than perhaps 1/10 of all the people here. Nevertheless, it perseveres and carries on, and this is 20 years of Left Hand Books, a very exciting event. And why does it happen? How do these things take root in this community or any community? Is it magic? Is it genes, biotechnology, something, sub rosa that we don't know about? Hardly. That was kind of a set-up question for myself. Hardly. Or softly. It happened because, as Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And that's exactly what happened in this community in the late 1970s. A small group of dedicated people, some of whom are here this evening, others who could not join us, got together and just came up with this wonderful project. Well, why don't we have a progressive bookstore in Boulder, Colorado? And they made it happen. And to them and to all the volunteers throughout the years, and hopefully volunteers in future years, many, many thanks, and we salute you for your great effort. What can you do for Left Hand other than being here this evening? Some very concrete things. The store is entirely run by volunteers. There's no paid staff. We need volunteers. We need people to go to the store and do shifts. It's not very complicated, and it's a marvelous way to spend a morning or an afternoon. I did a lot of my political education at Left Hand Books in the late 1970s when it was on the corner of Pearl Street and 19th. And I read a lot of books then, and one day I saw Allen Ginsberg walk into the store, and I said, God, this must be a really special place to find Allen Ginsberg shopping at Left Hand Books. And my career sort of paralleled Left Hand's as well, and I quickly became I believe I was in charge of the International Music Department, a very lofty title. I had enormous responsibilities ordering my favorite ragas from India and stocking the store with a lot of unusual music at that time. Please, if you can, volunteer. If you can't volunteer, buy a ton of books, okay? Very concrete. You can start with this one, Rich Media, Poor Democracy, or any of the other many books that are over there. And Bob McChesney will be here at the end of his talk to sign his book.
I'll sign any book.
He'll sign any book.
If they buy it.
And I will sign all of Noam Chomsky's books. I have permission to do that. And get this fabulous T-shirt. I mean, you're not going to be in if you do not have a Left Hand 20th anniversary T-shirt with a wonderful quote from Chomsky on the back. Citizens of democratic societies should undertake a course of intellectual self-defense to protect themselves from manipulation and control. Now that sounds like a program. And left hand intersects with that because it provides you with information that you cannot find anywhere else in this community. The magazines, the books, the poetry, the videos, the audios. It's an invaluable resource, and we can't take it for granted. And it's in a somewhat of a fragile situation. That's why I really urge you to get involved, get engaged. People always ask, oh, what can I do? You know, the corporate media is controlling everything, and I've got no time, and I'm busy online and surfing. If you just surf a little bit less, if you watch one less rerun of Seinfeld and sign up for a left-hand shift in the afternoon or some evening, it would be enormously appreciated. So, what do I want to tell you about our leading contender and featured speaker this evening? Bob McChesney is a longtime Cleveland Browns football fan. Today at the airport, this is pretty esoteric, he asked me Lou Groza's number, and I didn't know it. But he knew it. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of Cleveland sports. But we won't talk about it too much this evening because, as you know, the Cleveland Indians and the Cleveland Browns did not do well and are not doing very well. Bob is professor of communications at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's been a longtime activist in community radio at WORT in Madison, and he hopes in his new abode in Urbana-Champaign to continue working with community radio there. So here you have a speaker who not only talks the talk, but he walks the walk. He believes in community. He believes in solidarity, first and foremost. And solidarity is a very wonderful, precious resource. You know, you sort of can't put your hands on it, but it really injects a certain humanity into a community and a certain spirit that is truly irreplaceable. So when I asked Bob, 3-4 months ago, hey, Left Hand is having its 20th anniversary, can you come out? What do you think? It was like, oh yeah, sure, when? When can I come? When do you want me? And we arranged the dates, and here he is. I think a remarkable example of that spirit of solidarity. He's the author of Telecommunications, Mass Media and Democracy, Corporate Media and the Threat to Democracy. With Ed Herman, he wrote The Global Media System. His new book is Rich Media, Poor Democracy, of which Bill Moyer says, if Thomas Paine were around, he would have written this book. If Paul Revere were here, he would spread the word. Thank God we have in Robert McChesney their equal in his love of liberty and his passion to reclaim it from the media giants who treat the conversation of democracy as their private property, from Bill Moyers commenting on Bob's new book. So, without further ado, please welcome this great celebration, Left Hand's 20th anniversary, and Bob McChesney.
Well, thank you all very much. In fact, I was hoping you'd read all the other blurbs from the book jacket, too. You were getting on a roll there. That was really wonderful. Coming into Boulder, I was here once in 1972, and I came through, and to date myself, I was moving from the East Village to Berkeley, and I hitchhiked my way through here and saved with a friend. And it was a lovely town then, but I gather it's changed quite a bit in the last 27 years. But one thing, I've gotten two very differing messages about Boulder in the past week or so, and I've told friends I was coming. One came from David, who's been raving about the community here and speaking glowingly of KGNU. Thank you. I don't want to blow that one. KGNU, Left Hand Books, and all the great community here. Another from a friend who teaches in the faculty, who I will not name for her sake, who's saying, Boulder, it's a bunch of rich people, a bunch of Republicans, computer weirdos. And that's the last place you want to go. You want to go to Denver, where the real people live. And well, I think tonight's audience proves that David is right. This is an extraordinary turnout. And absolutely, I don't think the cameras can show this, but we have a large room, and it's standing room, and I think we must have 20 or 30 people, maybe 40 or 50 standing in the back. And I think it's a real testament to this community, to the institutions that have been built up that David alluded to, KGNU, Free Speech TV, and especially Left Hand Books. And I just want to also say, David's very modest, but he's also a primary reason I'm here. If David Barsamian ever asks you to do a favor, you always accept, because he is absolutely the first person who's always there for you. So when David asked me, it was a no-brainer. And he is someone, when you travel around the country like I do, you just mention David's name and it instantly brightens up the conversation. Oh yeah, David Barsamian, great guy. And it's really a treat to be here. What I want to talk about tonight is sort of a précis of the book, just a small bit. You can't avoid buying it after the talk. But just a few short comments about it. But being a college professor, I can't pass up the chance to have a captive audience. So my idea of short comments might run us a couple hours, but I'll do my best to get us out of here before the electricity bill's overdue. And really, my interest in media isn't media per se. My interest in media is media in its relationship to a good society, or what I would regard as a democratic society. I mean, that's why it's fundamentally important to me. And I think if you look at democracy, aside from media, I mean, there's certain things that we can look at history, we can look at other countries, we can look just in theory, and there are a handful of things that make societies more democratic or make the democracy superior than it would be otherwise. You need obvious things. You need to have some sort of fair rule of law that everyone can understand. You need to have the right to assemble, to free speech, freedom of thought without fear of punishment. You also need to have a commitment to social equality. A society with a tremendous amount of inequality can never really be democratic, because democracy, predicated on the formal equality of citizens, is undermined if you have some citizens worth $100 billion, shall we say, and others who are paupers. Likewise, for democracy to be successful, you have to have a sense of community, a social order in which people are rewarded for being greedy and selfish and penalized for being humanitarian is hardly conducive to building the spirit of community that you need for democracy. The feeling that what happens to your sister and brother affects you, and that you cannot be an island in any sort of society. These are all things that are necessary for democracy. But one other thing, what I'll talk about today, is media, the role of media for democracy, and specifically how our current media system is highly anti-democratic, in my opinion. And moreover, it's undermining efforts towards equality and efforts towards community. It works very much in the opposite direction on both those fronts. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, what do we need by media in a democratic society? You need basically two things. Not each medium has to do this, but the system as a whole, you need to do two things. First of all, you have to have a ruthless counting of people in power and people who want to be in power, so you know what they're up to or what they're going to be up to. Secondly, the system has to provide a wide range of perspectives and research and analysis on the important social and political issues of the day. So if someone's going to be a citizen, they can get informed, study things, participate, and weigh in, be actors, not just be passive couch potatoes in the system. That's sort of what you need. Now, our media system, I would argue, is a complete disaster on both those fronts. And it is for a fundamental reason. We have a media system that's set up to serve shareholders and advertisers first and foremost. And the public service needs, the roles of citizens, the needs of democracy, simply don't factor into the equation. What makes for good business, and oftentimes very good business, makes for bad politics, bad democracy. And that's why I titled the book Rich Media, Poor Democracy, because in conventional wisdom, if you go to most law schools or schools of journalism, or just talk to politicians or pundits, they would say if you have an unregulated media system, like we largely have, where there's very little state interference in the editorial affairs of the media, that will produce the most flowering possible marketplace of ideas that will invariably lead to the highest quality possible political culture. And in fact, that's the exact opposite of what has taken place in the United States. We have a rich media, but we have a very poor democracy. So let's talk about some of the reasons for this and how they manifest themselves. And then at the end of the talk, I'd like to talk a bit about what we can do about it, what's being done, because it's very exciting what's going on now with media activism, but sort of the road ahead for all of us so we can address these problems. Perhaps the striking trend in media in the past 10 years or 15 years has been the concentration in ownership. This is an issue I suspect many of you are aware of, but it's an issue that gets almost no coverage in the commercial media, except for the rare mention on the front page when a big deal goes down, and then it promptly reverts to the business section, where it's treated as a matter of importance to investors and to owners, but not to citizens, to the extent it was even considered like that on the front page. We're in the midst now of a stunning wave of consolidation of ownership in our media and our telecommunications industries, arguably unprecedented in economic history. And to give some perspective, if you looked at the U.S. media industry, say 50 years ago, in the 1940s, they were concentrated industries then. Each of the industries, film, broadcasting, radio, and then television, magazines, newspapers, tended to be dominated by a handful of companies, anywhere from 3 or 4 to 12 or 15, in what were called oligopolistic markets, meaning they're markets in which new competitors have trouble entering. That was the nature of our media system. Over the years since the 1940s, the number of firms in these industries, and including retailing, things like bookstores, has dwindled. There are fewer and fewer. There's more and more concentration. But what's really striking in the last 10 years, and what's really the important trend in concentration, isn't sort of fewer film studios or fewer bookstores, as much as it is the growth of the huge media conglomerate that's vertically integrated and has major holdings across a number of different media sectors. And that's what's new. That didn't exist 40 years ago. That's now the way all these firms are organized today. What do I mean by media conglomerate? We'll take the largest media company in the world, Time Warner. Look at what Time Warner owns. They've got the second largest cable system in the United States. They're the largest cable television station owning company, and they've got CNN, all those Turner stations, HBO, pieces of a lot of others. Largest magazine publisher in the United States, Time, Life, People, Sports Illustrated, Us, Them, I, You, that whole panoply. They have 2 major film studios, New Line and Warner Brothers. They're one of the 3 or 4 largest music companies in the world, Warner, Electric, Atlantic. Amusement parks. I mean, the list goes on and on. I'm sure I'm missing some major sectors. But that's the shape of the new media giant. And the fact is that to survive today, a media company needs to have all these different components for cross-selling and cross-promotional possibilities, or else they can't compete. They're at a loss. And that's why the independent has pretty much faded in the corporate media system, has faded from view. To give some sense of how this has taken place, just look at the size of these firms and how they've changed in the past 10 years. Time Warner in the late 1980s, when it merged in 1989, Time and Warner, each were like $2 billion companies. Well, next year, Time Warner will do about $30 billion in business. That's serious growth. That's growth, mostly through mergers and acquisitions. They bought Turner, but also through internal growth. Disney was like a $3 or $4 billion company a decade ago. Now it's a $25 billion a year company. Viacom, which just bought CBS, was a paltry $600 million a year company in 1988. Next year, assuming the CBS deal goes through, and it probably will, it'll do about $21 or $22 billion worth of business. In short, these companies have just emerged almost out of the blue. None of the dominant companies were in existence in a recognizable form even as recently as the late 1980s. So what we have today, after a wave of mergers and buyouts, including the most recent Viacom-CBS deals, a media system now dominated by 8 or 9 massive conglomerates. Who are these guys? Let me just give you their names. You don't have to write them down. They won't be on the exam. Interestingly, you won't recognize some of the names because you'll recognize the brand names of what they own, but you might not recognize the name of the parent corporation or recognize them as media companies. Time Warner and Disney that I've mentioned. Disney, of course, owns ABC, ESPN, film studios, all the amusement parks. Viacom, which owns CBS, soon to own CBS. MTV, VH1, Showtime, Simon & Schuster Book Publishers, Blockbuster Video Rental, Paramount Film Studio. They own their good share of stuff. Then Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. Let's not forget Rupert Murdoch. He's always there to show us the light to the future. They own seemingly everything else that I haven't named. No, not quite. But I mean, they own Fox Broadcasting, 20th Century Fox Pictures, cable or satellite television systems around the world, lots of magazines. It's probably one of the 2 or 3 largest newspaper publishers in the world, dominating Australian and British newspapers. They've also got a variety of interests in almost all the other media. The remaining companies are the German Bertelsmann, which is a huge music and publishing company in the United States, despite being German. Seagram, the Canadian drinks manufacturer that owns Universal Studios and bought Polygram last year and has major music interests. Sony, the electronics firm, which owns Columbia TriStar and has huge music interests in the United States as well. Our good friends at AT&T with Liberty Media, and I guess that's quasi-hometown team now, that they bought TCI. And they have massive holdings, not only in cable systems, but also through Liberty Media and our good friend John Malone. They own a piece of it, seems like virtually every cable company going, a cable station. And then finally, General Electric, owners of NBC. General Electric, a massive firm. And I'll give you just a summary of how to understand these companies. The first 4 or 5 are pretty much pure media conglomerates. Time Warner, Disney, Viacom, News Corp, and Bertelsmann. The last 4 are just large industrial conglomerates where media is just part of their holdings. But they're massive companies in their own right, each of them larger than the media companies that I mentioned. Now, this isn't the entirety of the media system, but among those 8 or 9 companies, you have all the major film studios, you've got all the major TV networks, you have most of the TV stations in the 10 largest markets in this country, a lot of the book publishing, a lot of the magazines. They dominate a lot of what we consider the heart of our media system, a lot of the music. But the system's rounded out by another 12 or 15 companies. These are like the New York Times, Knight Ridder, the big newspaper chains, some of the cable companies I didn't mention like Comcast, some of the big radio chains. But once you get those 12 or 15 plus the 9, you got 24 companies, that's about it. Those 24 companies cover the lion's share of the media experience of people in the United States. The overwhelming majority, the heart and soul of our media experience can be seen in these 24 firms. In a nation of 270 or so, 260 million people, it's an astonishingly small number of companies. And companies, I might add, that are even more tightly knit than what I just suggested, because not only is there just a handful of them, but they're closely interlocked, both through boards of directors and through what are called equity joint ventures, where they actually share ownership in projects together. In fact, in that first tier of 9 companies I mentioned, they usually have an equity joint venture with at least 7 of the other 8 giants. So they're actually partners in industry. Our good friends at Liberty Media, AT&T, are one of the 2 or 3 largest shareholders of both Time Warner and News Corporation. They're actually the biggest shareholder in a couple of these companies, and they're competing with them theoretically. I think John Malone of Liberty Media put it best. He said, look, it's hard to get angry at your competitors anymore because you compete in one market, but they're your supplier in another market and your partners in another market. And how do you get your game face on to go out and kill each other in that environment? Rupert Murdoch, the visionary of corporate media, has put it best. He said, when we're thinking about going into a new market, we've got 2 choices. We can either go into a new market, compete with someone, and then we'll kill each other, and then we'll make a deal after we've both blown a couple $1 billion, or we make the deal first. Hey, you figure it out. You make the deal first. And that's something I'll talk about a little bit later. Well, maybe I'll talk about it now, because one of the myths of this system, one of the defenses, is the result of a competitive market. In fact, you've probably heard this, David. There's a myth going around that our economy is based on competition. Has anyone heard that one? I get a kick out of that one, too, because that's the sort of pablum they sort of serve up to us down here at the bottom of the food chain. But Bill Gates is not worth $100 billion because of competition. He's worth $100 billion because he got rid of competition. The heart of this system, the key to profitability, is eliminating competition. The top, that's the whole goal. You minimize your competition, it lowers your risk, it maximizes your profit. And I'm not putting them down for that. If I was investing in companies, I would invest in a company where the CEO said, hey, I'm looking for people to compete with me. Get rid of that joker. I'm going to invest in the companies trying to nail the competition. Of course, that's just rational behavior. But that's the truth of capitalism. The point is to smash competition, eliminate it, make sure you can't ever have any. Not to encourage it. But unfortunately, why don't politicians ever tell us that? They give us these wonderful lectures like Jack Kemp and Dan Quayle. They leave that part out for some reason. At any rate, this is a fundamental problem for any democratic theory, to have so much power over media into so few hands. I mean, the average American now spends 11 hours and 40 minutes a day with some form of media. Basically, it's the province of these 24 companies. They have us for half the day, not half the waking day, half the day, literally. But there are problems more than just the theoretical one, because this sort of concentration accentuates the hyper-commercialism of our media system, the sort of commercial carpet bombing that we're increasingly inundated with, subjected to by this system. And the concentration accentuates it for a very simple reason. As these firms there are fewer and fewer of them with more and more power, they have less fear of retribution from competition or from the marketplace. They can do more and more what just makes the most money for them. So that means if you can run more TV ads during prime time and get away with it, you do it. If you can do product placement and get away with it, you do it. It's easier to hyper-commercialize when you have a very concentrated market. And there's also tremendous advantages to being a conglomerate. You can make a lot more money as a conglomerate than you can if you're an independent company. I'll give an extreme example, but I think it's an example that will clarify how this works. It deals with the film that Disney made called The Lion King. Has anyone here seen The Lion King? A lot of you probably. Yeah, I've seen it 11 times. One of the joys of having children in the 90s. And The Lion King is a very interesting movie. It did about $800 million in the global box office. And that was one of the biggest films in movie history. Now, if you know how the film industry works, the theater owners get to keep about half of that, and Disney gets to pocket the other half. So Disney's got $400 million. Then they've got to pay all their bills, all their expenses, and then what's left after they pay all their bills is a profit. And they pay their $10 in taxes. And so, how much profit do you think Disney made out of The Lion King? Well over $1 billion in profit. Well, how do you get the $1 billion out of that math? Well, you look at what else Disney owns and what else they can do with The Lion King besides show it in theaters. They can sell Lion King paraphernalia and merchandise in the 700 Disney stores that litter our malls all across the country and increasingly across the world. They can do Lion King spin-off TV shows on their Disney Kids network and on their ABC network that they own. They're in a position to do a Lion King Broadway show, which is a big hit on Broadway and is now traveling around the world, taking just the movie basically and putting it on stage. They can have Lion King rides at the Disney amusement parks. They can do Lion King books, soundtracks, CD-ROM. In short, there are thousands of ways to slice and dice the product to make money. To give it how this works, look at the next 3 animated films Disney made. Pocahontas, Hunchback of Notre Dame, and Hercules. 3 films that were critically not acclaimed, and bow wows at the box office. They only did about $200 million each at the global box office. But Disney made over $500 million in each of them in profit because it could exploit all these various revenues to take advantage of it. And what this means, basically, if you want to compete with Disney in the film of animated film market, you'd better have all those other tools or weapons to exploit, or your risk is going to be vastly higher. If your box office flops, you're just out of business because you don't have all those other things to plug into. Or the promotional side, too, using your other media to promote your fare. To give a good example of that would be a film called Prince of Egypt that DreamWorks made. And DreamWorks is the new studio of Steven Spielberg that's trying to do a new film studio, and they're trying to compete with the big guys making animated films. Now, I didn't see Prince of Egypt, but from what I'm told, it was a pretty good movie by the standards of these films. It was actually really good, much better than Pocahontas and these other ones. But it didn't do very well at the box office. And the consensus is in the industry, the reason it didn't do well is that DreamWorks didn't have all the incessant advertising on all these other media properties that the other giants could do, so they couldn't pump it up. For them to get that sort of publicity, they would have had to pay a fortune in advertising that they simply couldn't afford. So the film didn't do that well. Concurrently, though, Viacom, which owns Paramount and Nickelodeon and all these other things, put out a film called Rugrats, based on its Nickelodeon TV show, an animated film. Now, this film is an El Cheapo formula lame-o movie. I didn't see it, fortunately. This is what I've been told by experts of the young generation. It only cost like $10 million to make, but it made a colossal profit for Viacom because they were able to generate a huge market for it using all their promotional tools. How did they do that? Well, the week before the film comes out, they don't run it on Nickelodeon. They take it off the air for a week, so you have an army of 4-year-olds pissed off at their parents because Rugrats hasn't been on for a week. And that gets your attention, as you know. You also Viacom produces a show called Entertainment Tonight. It's their show. So what do? The week before it comes out, you have a 1-week special on the making of the Rugrats movie. So everyone's seeing all about Rugrats. Even MTV that they own has special Rugrats bits during the part of the day that kids that age are going to be watching MTV. In short, you can hype it and hype it and hype it, and you can generate an audience in a way you can't if you don't have a conglomerate. You can't afford to do it. And in short, you get a tremendous amount of what I would call hyper-commercialism as a result. Now, I should say, my point isn't that the system doesn't produce some good stuff. I don't account for 11 hours and 40 minutes a day, but I'm not 40 minutes a day. I'm 6 hours or something. I don't know where I am, but I consume my share of commercial media and corporate media. And there is some good stuff there, and it's there for a couple of important reasons. First of all, there's some extremely talented people who work in the commercial media, and they sometimes are able to use their talent to get good stuff in there. It's a battle for them at every time, but good stuff does get done. Secondly, audiences sometimes demand good stuff, and they do have enough leverage to get it out of the system. Now, one of the great defenses of the corporate media system is that it gives the people what they want. You know, you've probably all heard that one. I think I was in my crib and I heard someone leaning over telling me, the media gives the people what they want. And the logic here is supposed to be that if you don't like what's on the media, look in the mirror. It's because the morons out there are demanding it. And if the morons were demanding something better, the grateful and obedient media giants would gladly serve it up. That's supposed to be what we believe. And to a certain extent, there's an element of truth there. These firms, at one level, are definitely competing with each other. You know, the networks want the biggest audience possible for their primetime shows. The film studios want people to buy tickets to go to their movies. But the notion that the media system sort of gives people what they want also mystifies, clouds over, and obscures what is actually not a simplistic one-way relationship, but a very complex relationship between supply and demand. And I think it's worthy to take a few minutes to talk about this point, so you're equipped to argue with your conservative friends on it, because I'm sure if you ever talk about media, you got to cross this bridge sooner or later. First of all, the notion of giving the people what they want. Go back to the thing about competitive markets. That's based on competitive markets, so you have choices. That means if people don't like what's being produced, you can start a viable competitor to it. These aren't competitive markets. But there still is competition in a sort of a stunted sense. And here, look at one way to understand the relationship between supply and demand is to look at foreign films. I think consumption of foreign films in the United States in the past 20 years and how that's changed. In the mid-1970s, approximately 10% of the films shown on U.S. movie theaters were foreign films, made in places like France and Germany and Japan, places like that. By the mid-1980s, that figure had fallen to about 5, 6, 7%. Today, the figure for the amount of foreign films shown on screens in the United States theaters is down to 1/4%. Yeah. Now, by the give the people what they want hypothesis, that would seem to suggest that sometime in the late 70s and during the 80s, the American people collectively stood up, pounded their fist on the table, and said, get those foreign films out of my theater. And the grateful and obedient media movie theater owners obliged and got them out of the theater. But in fact, that's not what happened at all. What happened was, in the mid-1970s, you had a dramatic change in the way films were distributed in this country. You saw the end of the single-screen theater and the rise of the multiplex, generally owned as part of huge chains. Now, it used to be that all films were shown in single-screen theaters. It meant basically, you know, one theater owner could compete with anyone else who had showed movies. And if you went to a city like New York in the mid-1970s, there were around 24 theaters that showed nothing but foreign language films, foreign films. Seattle, where I lived in the 70s, had 6 or 7, I think. I bet Boulder had a couple of them. I'm just speculating, but I bet they had their share. This is the sort of town that probably was over 10%. But at any rate, what happens is you have the rise of the megaplex, and suddenly that single-screen theater is competing with someone who's got 8 or 10 screens. Now that single-screen theater's got one projectionist, so does this multiplex. One projectionist serving 8 screens. Single-screen theater guy's got one popcorn counter. Multiplex has one popcorn counter serving 8 screens. The economics are such the single-screen theater simply can't compete. The costs prorated are much lower for the multiplex. Single-screen theaters simply go out of business everywhere. So now the filmmaker in France or Denmark comes to the United States to sell their movie, to go to find a theater. There are no theaters left that used to carry their films, so they go to the multiplex. They say, hey, will you please carry my film? You know, it did really well, my last film here. And the multiplex says, well, we'll carry your film, but we've got to carry it on all 218 of our multiplexes. You know, it's too complicated for us to break down to one theater. That's not going to fly. So you have to be in all 218 multiplexes. Plus, of course, you'll have to do a standard promotional advertising campaign in each 218 markets promoting the movie so you can generate an audience. And the amount of these advertising campaigns is probably 5 or 10 times greater than the cost of making the movie. And over time, these companies simply can't do it. They can't afford to do it. They don't get carried. And gradually over time, they stop getting carried. People stop demanding it. Today, if I talk to my students at Illinois and before that at Wisconsin, I say, what do you guys think of foreign films? They look at me wide-eyed and say, you mean they make movies somewhere else? I mean, wow. When they go into the video store, it's unlikely they go to the foreign film section. So in a way, yeah, there's no demand for it now. That's true. But the idea that this is giving the people what they want is nonsense. It was a situation where supply creates demand as much as demand creates supply. My point is it's a very complex relationship. Also, even if you accept the idea that markets have strengths in certain ways as mechanisms to allocate public taste, at the same time, they have severe weaknesses, too, in the area of culture, journalism, and communication. I mean, they're notoriously conservative. The music industry is the classic case in point. Look at popular music in the United States. Virtually every breakthrough, creative breakthrough in popular music in the last 50 years has come from people who've avoided the corporate system, who've been working in garages somewhere, be it punk, be it rock in the 60s, be it reggae, be it hip-hop. It's always been on the fringes. And the corporate people, once they get a big hit, turn around, they're constantly trying to recreate it. Yeah, we want to get 15 bands that sound like the guy who had the hit yesterday, but it loses the spark, and it's always lame. They just can't, and they can't help it. They get worse at it. The harder they try, the lamer it gets. And, the market simply isn't a good mechanism for creative work. It simply is a failure in many respects. And it's also worth noting about markets that they don't really give the people what they want, is they give you what you want within the range of what you can make the most money at. And that's oftentimes a much narrower range than people might actually want if they had a broader selection of choices to pick from. In the 1930s, in my research in radio shows that most Americans did not want any advertising on the radio. And the broadcasters understood that. They knew that people hated advertising and found it very intrusive. But that wasn't a choice you got, because they couldn't even make any money off that one, so they just shelved that one. In 1995, the advertising industry did a survey and found that some system that's market-driven, and you can see the effects. You look at our magazine stands, and they're aimed primarily at the top 20% of the population, 25%. Cable news channels are pitched entirely, it seems like, at people with net worth in 7 figures, from what I can tell. Newspapers basically have written off the bottom 30 or 40% of their communities. $1, 1 vote, those people are losers. $1, 1 vote, rich people are winners. It becomes a very class-based media system. In a society like ours, which despite all the rhetoric about the great economic boom, has seen, I think, an unprecedented increase in economic inequality in the past 2 decades, our media system reflects that. The polarization of our society is strongly entrenched on our media, much more so than it was a generation ago. At the same time, so I would say my critique of the media system is simply that it's bad in the sense that what it gives us is so poor considering the enormous amount of resources that are applied to it, the tremendous gifts they get. And I think the thing that you see out, and I'm going to talk about journalism in a second, but in the general entertainment, is just the commercialization of the product has gotten so intense. What you see increasingly is that the border between creative and commercial is eroding. The notion that there's an editorial section, a creative section that's distinct from the commercial section, that sense of distinction is crumbling. It's been taken the farthest, I think, on cable television by our friends at Viacom on MTV and VH1, where basically they're just producing 24-hour infomercials, and they don't tell you that. The shows you see on these networks that are produced about movies are paid for by the studios, but they don't tell you that. They actually make you think it's a bona fide story about some movie that's coming out. The whole thing is wrapped up in commercialism. The point of it is simply to sell, sell, sell. Another place you see the disastrous implications of our current media system is with what's taking place with children in our society. For a society that loves to talk about how much we love children, and politicians are invariably wrapping themselves up in their grandchildren, what we're doing to children is nothing short of obscene. The average American 7-year-old today sees 1,400 hours of television a year. I think that's 28 hours a week, and sees 20,000 TV commercials a year. Now, I know some of you are young, you're in college age, you think, hey, I went through that, that's cool, it's no problem. But what kids are going through today is nothing like what even college-age kids are experiencing now. Now we have 4 full-time cable channels, 24 hours a day, bombarding kids with commercial programming, owned by the 4 largest media companies. It's really taken a whole new life. When you combine it with the commercialization of education that's going on, and the general commercial saturation of the entirety of our society, my God, there's nowhere you can look without advertising, it seems like. The long-term effects, or even the short-term effects, should be very troubling. The range of debate, in fact, on what this is going to do to children ranges from that's going to be sort of a problem to like this is going to be dreadful. But no one argues this is good for children. It isn't good for children. It's indefensible what we're doing to children. You know, and I'll just say one word about commercials and what we're doing to children, because if you understand the logic of what commercials are about, TV commercials, what they have to say to you and what they have to say to kids is there's something wrong with you unless you get this product. You're not pretty enough, you're not funny enough, you're not cool enough, you're not hip enough, you don't have the right friends, you're not this, you're not that. Unless you get this product, you're not, and they can't tell you, you're fine, you're okay, you don't need this product. I mean, that's not going to sell the product. Hey, you're fine, just the way you are, kid, keep going on with your life, you don't have to watch this ad. No, they can't do that. So you're getting 20,000 messages telling kids there's something wrong with you unless you own this product. It's absolutely just appalling. There's no other word for it. But journalism, I think, is the area that I'd like to talk about now, primarily is the area that should concern us, because journalism is the part of our media system most directly related to democracy, to self-government, to understanding how power works. And I think it's fair to say that in the last 10 or 15 years, the wheels have come off the cart of journalism in this country. The bottom has come out of the cup. It's in free fall. Do you get the point? I mean, you want me to go on with these analogies? And by saying that, I don't want to romanticize journalism 20 years ago or 30 years ago. In fact, quite the opposite. If you look at the origins of professional journalism that started at the beginning of this century, it developed not as a way to make journalism better for democracy. Professional journalism, the idea of neutral journalism, objective journalism, developed as a way that powerful newspaper publishers that had monopolies in most towns could make their products seem credible to the general public, not tainted by their own or advertisers' interests. And professional journalism, as it developed, has severe limitations built into it: reliance on official sources, a strong desire to avoid controversy, so avoid the tough issues that could get you in hot water, and it internalized many of the values of the status quo. It also left an illusory notion that journalists were in charge. They actually made the decisions ultimately about what went in the news in our media. But at the same time, with all the problems of traditional journalism, there was some autonomy on certain sorts of issues. And journalism, in the commercial sense, has done some outstanding work historically at uncertain times. It's a more complex issue than just to say it's good or bad. But in certain types of issues historically, and this is an important issue because the concentration doesn't really affect this necessarily, there's been very little wiggle room in our media among our journalists throughout the 20th century. And those issues, unfortunately, tend to be some of the most important issues. And these are issues where elites agree. The rule to understand how our media works, if the elite in the society, the top 1/2% that own much of the investment capital, the political leaders that work closely with them, the dominant people in our society, if they're in agreement, basically an issue, it's an issue that will not be debated in our media culture. That's true today. It's been true throughout this century. What's an example of the sort of issue that's off limits in our professional journalism? Well, the U.S. 007 right to invade any country it wants for any reason without any explanation. And we have that's not debated in our media. I mean, it's just a given that, yeah, you have the right to invade any country you want for whatever reason. I thought the classic example of that came and was it 1989 or 90 when we invaded Panama, 89, to arrest Noriega, and then Secretary of State James Baker, and it was on C-SPAN, thank you, that I saw this, because you wouldn't have seen this elsewhere, was giving a press conference. And some reporter said to him, you know, I've got the Organization of American States Charter here, and it says you're not allowed to invade member countries. You know, so like you're violating the charter, Secretary Baker. And Baker looked perplexed, like, how'd this guy get in here? and so he goes, you know, he paused and he goes, well, you know, we're having our lawyers work on that. We'll get back to you. And that was the last we heard of that issue. Another thing that's off limits is the questioning the equation of the market with democracy. That's simply a given. No matter what the empirical evidence is to the contrary, markets equal democracy. Even when you have a country like the former Soviet Union, take Russia, in total collapse with market policies leading to the most egregious anti-democratic political views, you still say, yeah, well, we have more free markets equals democracy. That's because in the minds of the people who run this country, there's no debate on that issue. The U.S. has a right to invade any country it wants to, because when it does, it's invariably to protect their interests. And the U.S. has the markets equal democracy because the whole point is to advance commercial and corporate interests. So they don't really care about democracy. They just tack that one on to keep us happy. The idea is to keep markets going, keep markets working. Now, most journalists internalize the values. That's not questioned. No censorship is really necessary in those sorts of issues. But there has been some autonomy on other issues, particularly issues where elites are disagreement. What sort of issues are they, or where they're irrelevant to elite interests? Flag burning. Boy, journalists can really work up a lather on an issue like flag burning. Because, who cares? That's one the steam blower offer. Oh, yeah, right, no, kill that guy, burn the flag. But not just obscure issues, but also important issues that simply, for whatever reason, don't affect elites directly. Abortion rights. They're split on that. There's debate on that. So there's actually better coverage of that than there is of U.S. invasions of other countries. There's better chance you're going to get a range of perspective on an issue like abortion rights. So, but that explains the sorts of issues you get your best chance at is when there are different sections of the elite duking it out on each other, or where it's issue irrelevant to the elite. But even the traditional autonomy journalists have enjoyed on certain types of issues has come under collapse. I mean, that's why I'm talking about the end of journalism in our society, because it's simply much more profitable for companies to attack this autonomy and hyper-commercialize the news fair as they lay off reporters and try to lower the budget to the bone. The figures in this wave of mergers, what's taken place, is nothing short of astonishing. Since the mid-1980s, there's been a 50% decrease in the number of journalists associated with the broadcast networks in Washington, D.C. Get rid of these guys. Who needs them? One study shows there are 20,000 more PR agents now trying to doctor the news surreptitiously than there are journalists and editors trying to write it. What's happened, basically, is journalists have to cover more and more space with less and less time, which means they're more and more reliant on PR people and have less time to really look up and investigate and find out what's going on. Even if you grant them the best of intentions, it's a very difficult task for journalists, because it's bad business to do good journalism. Gannett, one of my favorite newspaper chains, it owns 100 monopolies, 100 monopoly papers approximately in the U.S., bought the Des Moines Register in 1985, one of the great papers historically in the United States. It had a full-time reporter in every county of Iowa, covering the state for people in Iowa. And if you lived anywhere in Iowa, you could stay right on top of the whole state of Iowa. Well, Gannett came in and said, what are these guys doing here? Why are we paying 85 guys? They aren't even selling ads. Get rid of them. So they got rid of them. And if you understand how monopoly newspapers work, it's impossible to start a competing newspaper market. We haven't had a successful launch of a competitive daily newspaper in this country in a mature market since World War I. The logic, it's a monopoly market. So they just make their costs go way down, their profits shoot up, the quality stinks. That's the logic. That's the rational thing for investors to invest in, for companies to do to make money. Bad journalism is good business. Good journalism is oftentimes very, very bad business. Hard investigation of important social issues, of people in power, very bad business. Why is that? Well, real investigation means you have to get good reporters, you have to pay them well, they have to be trained people who know what they're doing. They've got to have time and resources to go out and investigate. Boy, that's a real, if you're running a corporate media company, what do you want to do that for? The same reporters, or a lot more being paid less money, could just, put a mic in front of a politician's mouth, take something off a satellite feed, fill up your news hole, and it won't cost you any money. It costs you a lot less money, at least. You make a lot more profit. Moreover, the worst thing is if an investigative report pans out and it's good, it's even worse, because then it gets you in hot water with someone who's powerful. And that's the last thing you want if you're a corporate media boss. The last thing you want to do is antagonize the corporate community, antagonize anyone in great power that might affect your commercial prospects, because the point is to make money. And once again, that's just simply the way the system works. When I say this, I don't think it's the good or bad people who are running our media system. It's really irrelevant. If Rupert Murdoch and Sumner Redstone and Michael Eisner and John Malone all decided to move to a commune and smoke dope the rest of their lives and have nothing to do with their media companies, their companies would still do the exact same thing. It has nothing to do with those individuals. I mean, they're better or worse at reading the market signals, but it's just rational behavior for people in these institutional contexts, which is why at the end I'll talk about the point is to change the institutional context so it's not rational behavior to have such a manure-laden media system. Moreover, worse than that has been the trivialization of news content, the real watering down of what a legitimate news story is. This town, it's sad to say, is the center, the epicenter of the latest moronic news story of the United States, and I won't even mention the name. But, O.J., Lorena Buttafuoco, you can read JFK Jr., you would have thought God had returned. I mean, JFK Jr. I mean, the guy's never been elected anything, but a week straight, nonstop. You know, the defenders of this sort of lame celebrity schlock journalism will argue, well, this is what people want. We're giving the people what they want. First of all, anyone in journalism who says they're giving the people what they want as a rationale for a story should be fired. I mean, that's just nonsense. But more importantly, it's not true. They aren't giving you people what they want. The reason, it's not demand-driven, it's supply-driven. It's so much cheaper to cover those sorts of stories than to do real journalism. CNN, Time Warner had their highest profits on CNN during the O.J. trial. All they had to do was put a camera in the courtroom, and a couple blowhards pontificate back and forth. And they just picked a couple lawyers who were out of work up. Say, hey, get up here, pal, for minimum wage. It didn't take any expert. And they were always wrong, but no one cared. I mean, they lay off a bunch of journalists, and they make killer profits. It's supply-driven. You know, you watch this stuff long enough, sure you get interested in it. After a year of that stuff, I wanted to know if Cato could get a job. I started watching it every day. But it's not demand-driven, it's supply-driven for the most part. Likewise, when this happens, you see the class bias that I talked about earlier emerging to the fore more and more in our media system and in our journalism. In the 1930s and 40s, labor reporters and editors were a common feature on daily newspapers in the United States. I don't know the exact figure, but I've heard figures as high as 1,000 full-time labor beat reporters in the U.S. 50 years ago. And these were not left-wing newspapers I'm talking about. These are on conservative, every bit as conservative as today. The newspapers in this country were very conservative and not pro-labor, but they had labor beat reporters because the majority of their readers were working class people, and labor issues were a fundamental concern. They didn't care less about the stock market. They weren't going to buy a paper to read about the stock market. So labor was an important beat. When the Flint sit-down strike took place in Michigan that established the United Auto Workers and really sort of paved the way for modern industrial unionism in the late 1930s, it was a front-page story in every newspaper in this country. It was talked about at dinner tables. Even the Chicago Tribune, that despises labor, covered it on the front page. And the Chicago Tribune was so right-wing that when Hitler came to power, its European correspondent defected to go work for Hitler. You know, I mean, serious. I mean, that's where they're at. They hated labor, but they covered it. It was covered. Now, how many labor reporters do you think in the New World Order of corporate commercial journalism are in daily newspapers in the United States? I don't know the exact figure, but you can count them on one hand, and you might not need your thumb. Just a few. Even Detroit, the center of the labor movement in this country for much of the past 50 years, the two newspapers there fired the last labor reporter in 1998 and replaced him at the same time by hiring 15 new reporters for the suburbs to cover consumer issues, like, the new yogurt stand that's about to open, or some new heroic entrepreneur who's out, creating jobs for us and building a 10,000-foot house that he desperately needs. So that's basically the sort of journalism we have. In its place, what we have now are thousands of business reporters. And one of the striking features just of the last 5 years is it used to be like there were business reporters and news reporters. Now they're sort of merged. Business reporters, news reporters, they're all the same because everyone's a business reporter now. They're all consumer affairs. They're all upper middle class news reporters, it seems like, in much of our media. If you look at the four main cable news channels, Fox News Channel, CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, the things are entirely merged. I mean, CNN's main national and international news show is called Moneyline. That's where they do their main news. It's just the interests of business, the interests of investors are synonymous with what journalism is all about in the new corporate world. Well, I don't think it takes a genius to know that that's absurd for a democracy, to have journalism pitched at the top 5–10% of the population to those needs and prejudices, and to claim that's the journalism that's going to give the basis for people to govern their own lives. Along these lines, the corporate media system's implicated another crisis that's often not connected to, but it's centrally implicated in it, which is the crisis of electoral democracy in this country. Voter turnout, as we all know, has plummeted in this country. I think for last year's election, it was 36% of the eligible adults voted on the congressional sequence in 1998, which was like 4 or 5% below what it had been just in 1994. I mean, it's just plummeting. But, there's another way to think about it. That sounds really low, and it is really low. It's extraordinarily low. But it's almost amazing that many people vote when you think about the choices. I mean, it's like a real testament to people's willingness to go through the ritual when you see how idiotic and lame the choices are. Jeff Cohen of FAIR says we have arranged the debate that ranges all the way from GE to GM. So that's your choice in there. But a big part of the problem with electoral democracy in this country is the sheer cost of campaigns, which prohibits public service-minded individuals from thinking of ever running. It's virtually impossible to run for a statewide race or congressional race now, unless you're extremely rich. This next year, it's anticipated that $3.5 billion is going to be spent on the electoral campaign of 2000, 40% more than 1996, and more than double 1992. Now, of that $3.5 billion, where's it going to come from? Well, here's a statistic you probably aren't going to hear on the news, but one I want you to remember. Of the individual campaign contributions that will be made for next year, 80% of the money will come from the wealthiest 1/4 of Americans. 80% of the money will come from the wealthiest 1/4 of Americans. And where will this money go to? It will go to pay for, over half of it, television ads on commercial television stations over the public spectrum. And this is an enormous cash cow for the broadcasting industry. They factor it into their earnings. It's the difference between losing money and making killer profits. Getting this money up front, $1 billion, because it mostly goes to the biggest stations owned by the biggest companies in the biggest markets. It's an enormous windfall, which is why the commercial broadcasters are the leading lobby that opposes campaign finance reform. They are the #1 roadblock to it. And so if you're interested in campaign finance reform, you better get interested in media reform, and vice versa. The two issues are linked at the hip. And another word on these ads, because I think it's worth mentioning, the content of these political ads. Now, we might be so inured after generation of asinine politics that we no longer can recognize just how absurd these ads are. But they are truly absurd. There was a famous advertising guy named Robert Spiro who worked for Ogilvy and Mather. He's the head of creative advertising for Ogilvy and Mather in the 70s. And Spiro was a famous person on Madison Avenue, and he was upset because he constantly heard people say, I hate political ads. It's just the way they're selling candidates the same way they sell beer or deodorant. Spiro was upset because he thought selling beer and deodorant was vastly more honorable than political advertising. So he took a year's leave from his job as creative director at Ogilvy and Mather, and he did a content analysis of every single TV presidential political ad from, I think, 1952 to 1976 or 1980. And he discovered that if those ads were held to the same standards his commercial ads were held to by the FTC at that time, not a single one would have been permitted to go on the air. All of them would have been deemed fraudulent. Of course, they're protected by the First Amendment, so they couldn't. But that's the caliber of those ads. They're absolutely destructive to democratic discourse. And along with the rise of political advertising to really the main lingua franca now of politics has been the decline of journalism on elections. Journalism has virtually fallen off the map. There is no journalism to speak of on broadcasting anymore dealing with electoral campaigns. California, someone did a study of the local TV coverage of the gubernatorial campaign in 1974 when Jerry Brown replaced Reagan, in 1998, last year's election when Gray Davis won. And they found there was 10 times more coverage in 1974 on local TV stations of the gubernatorial race in 74 than there was in 98. I mean, the message is loud and clear. The TV station owners saying, you want to get on the air, pal, buy an ad. That's what it's all about. You're not getting on any other way. And you're not going to be taken seriously when we do cover stories unless you do buy ads. You're not going to give freebies, pal. You got to buy your way into this story. It's really a disastrous situation. In the state that I live in, Wisconsin, in 1998, we saw a real testament to the problem that faces politics in this country and this sewer of money and political advertising. Senator Russ Feingold was up for re-election. And Feingold, who's been active in the campaign to limit campaign finance spending to sort of open up our elections, Feingold refused to take soft money contributions. He said, I'll only take the sort of standard kind that you're allowed. I won't take this soft money, which is you can get as much money as you want from people to run these character assassination ads. His opponent in the race said, no, heck, I'll take them, sure. Come on, send it my way. And the Republicans did. They sent it that way. And Feingold's opponent basically filled the airways with a barrage of advertising. And he outspent Feingold 5-10 to 1. I'm not sure the figure, but it seemed like you didn't see any Feingold ads, and all you saw were ads for his opponent. And the ads dealt with the weighty issues of flag burning and what's called partial birth abortion. And for what I know of partial birth abortion, the ads completely mischaracterized the situation altogether. But Feingold's put in a very difficult spot. He's got a lot less money. Now, if he doesn't do anything, these ads just sit out there over and over and over. People say, oh, he's not responding, it must be true. And he saw his lead in the poll plummet till he was finally behind. So he's put in a spot, does he just spend all his money answering these ads and doesn't even get a chance to give up his own message? Or does he just sort of get clobbered? What's he going to do? Is that he barely won the election. But the real problem there is there's no press coverage to help him. The ads dominated the whole political discourse. There was no media. There were no articles in the newspapers or the broadcast media clarifying what absurd claims were being made in these ads. They were just left to sit there. Feingold, it was up to him to buy another $5 million ads to answer them, or else they weren't going to be answered to the citizens of the state. It's truly unacceptable. It's a crisis. And media is at the center of the crisis, right at the heart of it. Now, I've covered a lot of ground, and I think I just want to talk about a couple other things before I wrap up. First of all, and most importantly, an issue I haven't mentioned yet, perhaps if I had mentioned this at the beginning, I could have stopped, the internet. Hey, it's going to set us free, right? I mean, no need to worry about these big media giants and advertising. We're all going to go online and go into cyber Valhalla and whiz around up there, dodging the ads and just grooving on our mutual genius. Of course, this is the new defense of the status quo, that now everyone's going online. These media giants are all going to be like so many clumsy dinosaurs because the internet's this massive comet is going to hit the earth and make them extinct. And we're all going to be doing our own thing in cyberspace and having just a wonderful time living happily ever after. And I take it from just one day here that this state is especially loaded up with these sort of internet blowhards, talking about how how radical and hip they are with these wild technologies. This is a species of human I have little patience for. The fact of the matter is, the internet is going to change everything. It is changing everything. We all know that. I mean, even if you don't participate in the internet, it's changing everything. It's one of these things you don't, without control. But the claims that it's going to alter our media system simply have no evidence. I mean, our media system's changing, but the idea that it's going to take the power away from the existing media giants, from commercialism and from advertising, and hand it over to hundreds of thousands of young, plucky, upstart webmeisters, is simply, there's no evidence to support it. In fact, after 5 years of the commercialized internet, it's quite clear the opposite is taking place. In the past 2 years, in the past 5 years, lots of people have tried to start up these internet content upstarts. Yeah, barriers to entry are low. I can start my own web page. I can go up against Disney and Time Warner. I can make my mark. I can be a web zine. People buy ads in it and send me their money because they like it so much. And what's happened has been a huge shakeout. Virtually all of them have gone out of business. Microsoft has spent $200 or $300 million trying to be a media company on the internet. Said, hey, this is our chance to take that one over too. Even Microsoft threw in the towel last year. Said, we can't compete with those guys. We'll just partner with them from now on. We're not going to try to do what they do. There's only a few left that are trying to make it as commercial entities in the internet. And they're all losing money, and they're all desperate to be sold. They're trying to just find someone to buy them, to use them as a flagship for their portal or their other websites. And what's become increasingly clear, and is widely known on Wall Street, but is less often shared with the general public, is that the existing media giants have spectacular advantages as they turn to the internet and as the internet becomes a commercial mass medium. First of all, they have digital content already that they can plug in, that they're from their other media. I mean, I'd have to actually produce the stuff that costs a lot of money. They can just plug in some cartoons and movies and all sorts of other stuff and horse around with that. Secondly, they've got the brand names that will attract people so that they'll use their leverage with portals and with web browsers to get pole position on your screen. And all the research shows that if you've got pole position on a screen, you have a spectacular advantage. People might be able to type in 900 characters to get your website, but if they can just click on something on the screen, most of them are going to end up clicking on that thing on the screen. Pole position on the screen is crucial for making it, which is why these firms pay so much and work so hard to make sure they get it on the screen. Third, the existing media giants have spectacular promotional ability. They can constantly hype their websites on their traditional media. You see it constantly in TV, films, magazines. And they can bring their readers, their viewers, their consumers over. And they bring their advertisers over. So when Miller Beer signs a contract with ESPN to cover NFL football, they can say, why don't you put 10% of that on our ESPN sports zone, or whatever it's called, sports scene on the internet. And so they bring Miller Beer over. Now, let's say I know a lot about sports, as David gratefully pointed out. Let's say I decided, hey, I know more about sports than Michael Eisner, owner of Disney. I'll start my Bob McChesney website on sports, and I'll go get the Miller Beer account. I'm going to blow them away and see how smart I am. So I knock on the door and say, hey, I want the Miller Beer account for the Bob McChesney sports website. You know, it would be like Michael Moore trying to get past the intern, at the door. It's just not going to happen. That money's not coming my way. It's not going to come to anyone. No matter how good my site is, it's going to go to ESPN, period. Moreover, these existing media giants have tremendous leverage, as I said, with the portals and the browsers to get that pole position. I'd have no leverage. None of us would. And that leverage is crucial. And finally, the media giants have a very long-term view on the internet that no rational investor could have unless you were a media giant. It makes sense for Time Warner or Disney or Rupert Murdoch to drop $100 million a year on their internet activities because they're sitting on a $50 or $100 billion empire that eventually the internet's going to intersect with. They can't afford to just blow that off and hope that it'll not affect them. They can lose $100, $200 million a year until they finally figure it out. Any rational investor to drop $200 million a year if they didn't have the core enterprise would be absurd. You could take that money and invest it in a much saner investment. And that's why they provide most of the venture capital for internet startups at this point. And finally, about the internet, if it's not going to set us free, one of the most distressing things about it has been if you look at the content of the internet, the commercial internet especially, the people who are making money off it or trying to, it's even more commercial than the traditional media. One of the recurring themes, if you study journalism and look at the way journalists operate, is the notion that there's the barrier between editorial and commercial, which is bad enough in decline in traditional media, is basically eliminated on the internet. To attract advertisers, news websites and the internet basically do anything to get them in and grant them privileges and leeway they would never grant traditionally in their normal media. Now, all of this can seem pretty depressing, right? I understand that. But I'm a very optimistic guy. David and I, we're sort of like the Bobbsey twins of the left. I mean, we think things are just going great. And there's a variety of reasons for this. But I think I've always been of the school, if you understand how things work, instead of depressing you, it liberates you, because then you can change them. Until you understand how things work, being blissful ignorance is nonsense. You're just in ignorance. And so one of the most important things, one of the great myths of our media system that's rarely talked about, is that this, the idea is presented, this is the natural American system. That, this is the founding fathers, they wrote the First Amendment, what they had in mind was 10 companies, huge shareholders are going to dominate the whole thing. And that this system is the result of plucky, hard-working entrepreneurs duking it out in the free market. And the government's only role is to be this nasty thing that comes in and tries to censor it because you have pointy-headed bureaucrats who simply can't stand the idea that people are having fun. This is sort of the conventional wisdom that we're given about the relationship of government to media and how our media system evolved. In fact, that's exactly untrue, and it's a complete lie. First of all, the media system in this country at the time of the Revolution, at the time of the First Amendment, and well into the 19th century, in many respects was 180 degrees different from our current system. Highly partisan, not especially profitable, not much advertising, extremely different. Even the media system as it became commercialized in the 19th century was radically different than the one we have today. It was highly competitive, still quite partisan, and still the owner and the editor were usually the same person. Well, for the first 120 years. You didn't have the corporate system where the owner was separated from the editor or the reporter, and then all the privileges, the First Amendment rights, go with the shareholders, not with the editors. So there was a fundamental difference there. Could have gone the other way. Would have made for a much better First Amendment, I think. But at any rate, most importantly, though, the government has hardly been an innocent bystander. It has been a subsidizer of our media system from the beginning of the Republic with postal subsidies. But in the 20th century especially, our current media system exists not despite the government, not independent of the government, but the government set it up. The government is integrally related in the subsidies, the laws, the regulations that made these giants possible, that made them so profitable. In fact, all these things are generally done in our name, in the public name, with no public input, no press coverage. We don't even know about it. But it's done in our name through enormous policies. What sort of things am I talking about? Well, the most striking way the government creates and subsidizes the corporate media system is through the free gift of spectrum to commercial broadcasters. They basically give it to them. They don't get anything in return, not a penny. And this is basically monopoly rights to use a signal in a community. It's a license to print money in many respects. And with this right, broadcasters have built up massive fortunes into the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars if you go back to the 1920s. That's a huge gift, and we get nothing in return. And we get nothing in return because the commercial broadcasting lobby, the corporate media lobby, flosses their teeth with politicians' underpants. They basically have they've got the system wired. We don't know about it. We're kept in the dark. And they, get to this in a second. When we find out about it, we don't like it, and they know that. So they do everything in their power to keep it in the dark. Take the internet. The internet is a wonderful testament to socialism, or at least to public sector investment. No private capitalist would ever have invented the internet. It wouldn't have made any sense. No one could figure out how to make a dime off the thing for 20 years. In the 70s, it's reputed the government went to AT&T, said, "Will you guys take this thing over? It's cost a lot of money." AT&T looked at it and said, "Hey, we can't figure out how to make any money on this. You keep it." But now we're supposed to believe all of a sudden that Bill Gates invented it. Of course, we're supposed to believe Bill Gates is infallible. Sort of like Bill Gates, he's worth $100 billion. He must be a much better person than everyone else. He's smarter, he's better looking, funnier, he has better sex, he has a bigger house. He's just, awesome. He's not even a human, maybe. He's from a different species, like all these rich guys. It's a lot of hooey. I mean, Bill Gates is the Ringo Starr of the information age. He's like Jethro Clampett or Jed Clampett. He's sitting on this sort of monopoly oil well, and then he's got $100 billion to play with, ruining everyone else's life. And we're supposed to worship him like he's, God's gift to the human race. But it's a classic case. The internet was a public subsidy. Then finally, after 20 years of the public subsidizing it, it looks like you make money off it. It's privatized without a shred of public debate, without a moment of congressional deliberation, all behind closed doors, given away, and the organization, the control of it is now basically the industry hands, self-regulating for the most part, although it's still up for grabs and something we should be fighting over. And then you look overseas where the relationship between government and our media system is especially clear. The U.S. government is the primary advocate of these media giants opening up markets around the world, from China to Europe to Asia to Latin America. So that's the truth of the issue. The government is the primary creator, the advocate of this system, and it's doing this in our name, but we haven't participated. It's a regulation without representation, or deregulation without representation, to put it more mildly. Because when you look at the seminal law that we now have to deal with, the Telecommunications Act of 1996, this was a law that basically replaced a law that had been in place 62 years. It's sort of the final statement by Congress on all electronic and digital communication indefinitely, maybe for generations. Radio, TV, the internet, telephone, cellular, the works. And what was the caliber of debate about this law? When this is the one time the Congress was supposed to meet to decide what would the public interest be? Well, the caliber was atrocious. It was non-existent. Now, don't get the idea there weren't huge fights going on. There were massive fights going on, but they were between these massive lobbies. They were between the telephone lobbies and the broadcasters' lobbies and the computer lobbies, duking out to see who got the biggest piece of the pie as they set up the system increasingly to serve their interests. But no one was debating about who owned the pie. It was their pie. We didn't get any part of it. And they got to do what they wanted with the pie. As a result of that law, we saw some of the most corrupt lawmaking in American history. The gift of spectrum for digital TV to the existing broadcasters without an iota of debate, valued anywhere from $50 to $100 billion, basically handing the reins of television, and really maybe perhaps the internet, when you look at how digital TV intersects with the internet, for the next 50 years, to the same guys who've done such a great job for the last 50 years, without even having a hearing on it, not even saying, well, what terms should we get from these guys in exchange? It was purely a gift. It was snuck in there by powerful lobbyists, pure and simple. Or a more down-to-earth example of the corruption of that law, what's happened to radio in this country in the past 3.5 years. The Telecommunications Act deregulated significantly the ownership requirements in radio. It used to be, believe it or not, in the olden days, you could only own 2 radio stations in a market and 14 nationally. Well, thanks to the 1996 Telecom Act, you can now own as many stations as you want nationally, and up to 8 in the largest markets. Since the passage of that law, over half the stations in this country have been sold. We now have a handful of giants that own several hundred stations, the largest owning 840, that dominate radio in this country. And virtually every market is a duopoly or a triopoly, with 2 or 3 companies owning all the stations, or 90% of the stations, and most of the audience. And I think radio is a good way to end this discussion, because in no other way does the criminality and corruption of our media system more apparent. Because look what's happened to radio. These companies that own 8 stations in a market, What do they do to make more profit? Well, do you need 8 engineers and 8 news staffs? Do you have 8 stations? No. One will handle all 8 stations for you. You can slash your costs to the bone. If you've got 500 stations and you've got 100 country stations, do you need 100 different music directors making your playlist and getting to know local musicians in each market? No. One person can do that for you. It saves you a lot of money. And the corporate headquarters working with the advertising industry to make sure you play the exact songs that are most likely to turn your desired demographic upside down, shake the money out of their pants. That's the whole point. And so look at what you have in radio today. Wall Street journals are raving about the profits these companies make, so they slash costs and serve advertisers. But you listen to radio, you can be airdropped into Boulder, Seattle, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, or Bangor, Maine. The oldie station's probably playing the same song. The country station's probably playing the same song. There's no news to speak of, or almost none. And what you hear is atrocious. It's just reading the morning newspaper to you. It's a disaster. So it's an ideal system for shareholders, for advertisers, and a disastrous system for citizens. What should be our most creative, our most local, our most inexpensive and accessible electronic medium has become our most regimented and most standardized. And I think it typifies the problems we face today. So why am I optimistic? Why very good question. I'm optimistic for a couple reasons. First of all, when you see the extent these companies go to keep these activities quiet, to keep them out of the public eye, you get very optimistic. They know when this stuff gets out, they're in trouble. I mean, they didn't even want the congressional committees to debate this stuff. They don't want it debated anywhere. Because they know when people hear about it, and they do hear about it, they do get upset, whatever their political views. Republicans don't like this. No one likes it, this sort of ripoff. So that gives you, I mean, as soon as the media giants sort of steal this stuff, then they act like they don't care if you know about it, then I'd be pessimistic. They say, we just screwed you out of $100 billion, You know, they do that, then I say, yeah, and they get away with it, then I'll be pessimistic. Until then, I'll be optimistic. Moreover, there's been a real change in morale sentiment towards media issues in this country in the past 10 or 15 years. I mean, 15 years ago, the critique I've made today would fall on deaf ears. I'd get a lot of abuse from people. Today, I make this critique to a lot of audiences, Kiwanis clubs, Rotary clubs, church groups, and invariably it's supportive. I mean, people have good questions. They ask me hard questions. They don't always agree with me. But they say, yeah, this is a serious problem. This is something we've got to address. The problem, of course, is that the range of debate in Washington is the range of big money debate. What big money permits is what you can debate. But as soon as you get outside the Beltway, it opens up. People will say, yeah, let's do something about this system. And one way you see this with journalists. That's really one of the great changes in the last 15 years. You know, in the earlier mid-'80s, journalists, and before that, journalists were usually the primary defenders of the commercial media. If you were to criticize the system, they'd get very thin-skinned. They'd go, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. The system works fine. You know, shut up. Get out of here. They were notorious for being thin-skinned. When I went to grad school back in the early 80s, after being a journalist and a publisher for a few years, I talked to my friends who were still journalists, and I'd give them my critique of the media like the one I've given you today. And they'd say to me, oh, Bob, you don't know what you're talking about. You know, you've been reading all these books. You're off in the library, in the seminar room. We got everything under control in the newsroom. You just go back to the campus. Well, now I talk to some of the same friends in the 1990s, and I give them my rap about the media, the one you've heard today, and they say to me, oh, Bob, there you go again. You know, you're off in the campus, in the seminar room, in the library. You don't know what you're talking about. It's much worse than you think. I mean, there's the real sense that there's fundamental problems in our society that are much deeper than they've ever been before, and that media is something that has to be addressed if we're going to do it. I'm also optimistic because as you look around the world, this system we have here is rapidly, as a part of the whole globalization process, being globalized. And everywhere in the world is facing a situation not unlike the one we face in the United States. But what's heartening is how in so many countries, Sweden, New Zealand, India, Brazil, media politics, media reform is being put right in the heart of the political agenda by democratic political parties. And it's very exciting. And I think that's the lesson we have to take, too. We have to make it a political issue in this country. Because I don't think you can win media reform is a single issue. I think it's too abstract. I don't think you can organize enough people. You can't organize enough people. And in this sort of issue, you need organized people to beat organized money. It's got to be part of a broader reform to democratize society, to challenge inequality, to challenge the rule of the market, to campaign finance reform, environmental reform. There, I think that media reform is a necessary component, a cornerstone of a progressive platform. And that's the way I think ultimately if we win anything fundamental, we'll win it. But in the meantime, there are a number of exciting campaigns that have developed, a number of developments in this decade that give me reason to think it's a burgeoning movement. We've only gone 3 inches in the past decade in a 2-mile journey, but there have been 3 very difficult inches and important inches. What sort of stuff am I talking about? Well, local media groups. Paul Kleitz here. I don't know how long your operation's been in 5 years, but something like Paul Kleitz of Rocky Mountain Media Watch. There weren't things like this, doing this really good analysis of commercial news media back in the 80s. A group like Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting barely existed in the 1980s when it started. You had a couple people working out of a closet in New York. Now you've got 10 full-time staffers. David Barsamian's Alternative Radio, which provides alternative radio programming. 3 full-time staffers doing great programming. There's a lot of success stories. A lot of things are happening that are very positive. Just in the past year, 2 major groups have been formed to work at the national level for media reform. Groups working to give us genuine public broadcasting. A group called Citizens for Independent Public Broadcasting. Bill Moyers is connected to them, and we already know what a smart guy he is. That was established in the introduction. Because, you know, we don't have public broadcasting in the United States. We have nonprofit commercial broadcasting pitched at a sliver of the upper middle class. And it's really, what we need is real non-commercial broadcasting aimed at the entire population, with local community and public access channels, local channels and national channels, and high-quality production resources to put out a good product. There's also movements to make real requirements on commercial broadcasters called the People for Better TV. Now, my wish list for requirements in commercial broadcasters tend to be a little heftier than theirs, but I'm working on trying to push them my way. Maybe you'll help me. I think, you know, as a condition of a broadcast license, we ought to say no TV political ads. You want to broadcast, get rid of those stupid ads. That's fair enough. We don't need those ads. That would wipe out $2 billion right away. And would also maybe possibly return some sanity to our broadcast, to our political culture. Likewise, I'd make it illegal to broadcast advertising to children under 12. That's the practice in Sweden, and there's a big struggle coming up to make it the law across Europe. Its time is long overdue in this country. We should have children's television, but it should be in the hands of educators and creative people, not in the hands of Wall Street and Madison Avenue. And we've seen what a fiasco they've done with that. And there's a whole host of other things I could go into. Maybe in the question and answer period I'll talk about them. But short of political reform, there are something you can do right now. And it brings us back to the whole reason for this event, which is to celebrate left-hand books. What we can all do is better support those independent media, those resources that currently do exist, because if we ever lose them, it costs 10 times as much to bring them back. Support them, nurture them, give them everything we possibly can. I'm convinced that just the current people who currently use the left-hand books, the alternative radio, FAIR, the Rocky Mountain Media Watch, if just the people did a better job of supporting those resources, we could instantly improve this media without any changes in Washington. We could do wonders. And so I think that's the challenge for each of us, is to keep these diverse ideas alive, sort of keep the independence of spirit of critical inquiry that Chomsky talks about in the back of the left-hand T-shirt, which we hope you're all about to buy. You know, that's something we can directly affect ourselves, and my challenge to you and to myself is that we all do that now and for as long as we can. Thank you very much. I guess we have to leave at 10, so I'll do 15 minutes of Q&A and then book signing, and I guess there's goodies over here of birthday cake. Is 15 minutes okay for Q&A? Or? Okay, sure, I'll be glad to. And I think there's a mic there so we can get it for people who ask it. Back here is the first hand I saw, yes. I guess just shout, I don't know.
The very last thing that you said, I have the impression that the choices that we make really do make a difference. But earlier on, you really stressed that this whole thing is supply-driven, not demand-driven. I think that the bulk of your presentation today, which was extremely helpful, I learned a lot. But the bulk of it, I think, was to make me and probably everybody else here feel pretty powerless. That what we did doesn't really make a difference. But then at the end, you seem to say that what we did really does make a difference. And it seems to me, I like what you said at the end, you know, that regardless of what's out there for us, if we just turn it off, if we just don't listen, if we don't patronize those newspapers, those movie theaters, those television channels, eventually, it might take a little while, they're going to change, don't you think?
Actually, I meant two different things. At the end, when I was talking about all of us using our resources and our energy to support independent media that exists in bookstores like Downtown Books, that didn't mean by doing that they could then have a dominant force in our society. They'll still be marginal, but they can be healthier and better, be an embryo for a better media system. But that's not good enough. Ultimately, we need, why should we be subsidizing big corporations? Why shouldn't subsidies be going to nonprofit media? That's a much more rational. We've got to engage the fight at that level. Why concede to the corporate power they get these massive subsidies? I think that's absurd. So, I mean, it's a multi-level fight. What I was saying at the end is what we can do short of engaging in a broad political fight, what we control, we should do our best to keep our independent media alive. But I think you and I would disagree on one point. I mean, I'm not of a school that just convincing everybody to turn off their TVs is going to ultimately change the system. I mean, I'm not opposed to trying to talk people to turn the TV off, but I'd rather, instead of spending a lot of energy saying turn it off, explain how it works so we maybe change it. So you would next want to watch something good on it, rather than just try to say, okay, I'm going to close out this world. I'll let corporations run the entire world, except for this little cubby hole I'm going to build in front of my face. That's no solution. Why are we letting them have that much power? Screw it. It's our world, not theirs.
Regarding all this merger and conglomeration with corporations, I haven't seen anything from the government as far as anti-monopoly, and now all of a sudden I'm hearing Microsoft. What's up with that? Why Microsoft is being singled out, yet there's all this other monopoly
I'm not an
stuff
expert on
going on.
Microsoft, although you've already seen I'm an expert on Bill Gates. The Microsoft situation is a little different from most of these other mergers because they genuinely did have a monopoly in standalone computer software. In a way, none of these media companies has that sort of monopoly. And they were able to use their monopoly profits quite rationally. And if I was a shareholder of Microsoft, I'd want them to do what they did. To use those monopoly profits to move into other markets and ace out all the competition there. I mean, that's what smart business people do. So it was a very egregious violation of even the most narrow interpretation of antitrust. I think that was a factor. Secondly, a factor in it was that all the other powerful companies in the industry were egging the government on, their lobbyists were, which gave them, you know, if all the challenge of antitrust would be if the whole industry opposed it, if they still went ahead with it, which I think would be highly unlikely in our political culture. What's going to come of it, we don't know. But antitrust, I think, is something that's very important that we need to think about in terms of media, or at least putting in media ownership requirements. One thing I'm in favor of is a law that would say you're only allowed to own one radio station, period. You know, now all these people bellyache, hey, I bought 1,000 stations, you know, so I could make a fortune. Now I'm going to lose a lot of money. Well, tough luck. That was your risk when you bought it. You thought you could buy off the politicians indefinitely. Well, now your chickens have come up and we're taking them back. One station per owner. This, you know, the broadcaster radio signal is very inexpensive. It really is. We'd find donors for every station in Boulder. We have no trouble. They didn't buy one. You know, well, you can chip in and buy one, but it would make a much better radio system. And antitrust in general, though, you know, to employ antitrust in media today wouldn't mean abandoning the tradition of antitrust. It would mean going back to it, the original tradition, the Sherman and Clayton Acts represent. Antitrust, believe it or not, this will come in the news for a lot of you, I suspect, was not a movement of lawyers and tax accountants to sort of deal with bad prices in suburban mall stores if they had too much market power. The antitrust movement was a populist political movement, it was a mass movement. It was based on the premise that too much concentrated economic power was bad for democracy. You couldn't have self-government if you had people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and Morgan owning everything. And the spirit of antitrust is to break up huge concentrations of economic power. And I think it's the original spirit, and that was the spirit actually for the first generation or two of antitrust. It's only in the last 40 years that it's been given this very neutral, technocratic spin, so it's virtually worthless for media. If we went back to the original interpretation, I think that media would be the first industry that would be studied. And I think most people who are experts in antitrust would agree that it's ripe for that sort of treatment.
Let me just interrupt for a second. A breaking news story just handed to me.
Crackers, the corporate crime-fighting chicken, just came here from an action at the University of Colorado to fight Disney's attempt at recruiting on campus. Crackers is here. Crackers, the corporate crime-busting chicken, is here in solidarity with Left Hand Books and celebrating its 20th birthday. Thank you, Crackers. And now back to our regular program.
Ms. Crackers, want to take some questions? Chickens are so shy. Yeah, here it is.
There's a right-wing station about 60 miles from here, up near Fort Collins, a little town called Johnstown, KHNC. They're pretty right-wing. They're AM. I look at them once in a while because I tend to be extreme. And just today I was surprised they were doing a station on decriminalization of various drug substances. Sometimes we need to look at who we can work with. They're not always.
And I'm glad you raised that. This reminds me of a story. I was at this conference a couple years ago, and the group Fairness and Action Reporting, which I really love, FAIR, they're outstanding, was having a session, and they were talking about how they'd organized an action against one of these right-wing kook radio hosts out in Phoenix. I guess this guy was just really bad news. And I was sitting there listening to it, and boy, I said, this guy sounded terrible. I said, boy, this guy's really bad news. I'm glad FAIR is doing this. But the name of the guy they mentioned rung a bell. So when I get home, I look at my notes, and I realize I'd been on this guy's radio show. And I didn't realize it. And what was frightening was all the callers agreed with me. I was talking about the digital TV giveaway, the giveaway of Spectrum and the Telecom Act, and they were all agreeing with me. Every one of them. And I think that points to your point. We have to be careful not to use these categorizations too loosely. I mean, we have a very depoliticized society, so these left, right, how people identify doesn't necessarily mean how we taught to think those terms mean in school. That doesn't mean people on the right are our buddies always, but it does mean that there's oftentimes a lot of common ground that might be there if you actually talk to each other. As I've done a lot of these right-wing talk shows since, and usually the argument I give here, I give the exact same one there. I don't water down my language. I speak the same way to everyone. You know, I usually have a yelling match with someone like Gun Nut, and that makes great radio. You know, but aside from that, you know, it's interesting how much you know, concern there is. And I view it, you know, basically the right wing has a media critique, which is nonsense. It's like evil liberals run the media and are doing all these awful things. You know, and the right says, look at all the violence, the lousy stuff on TV, this is why. Well, they're describing a situation that is actually, I agree with a lot of their saying this is what's wrong, but their explanation for it is atrocious, and their solutions are lame. So we can just go in and give a good explanation, and with a good explanation, give real solutions. I mean, that should be our goal. Yeah.
I know a lot of my friends and family members listen to NPR, and that's their sense of real, honest news. Can you touch on the metamorphosis of NPR in the last 15 or 20 years?
I mean, I'm not an expert in NPR because I don't listen to it a great deal, but I mean, I think it's trying to set itself up as sort of the voice of authority on the airwaves now, the national airways. And during the most recent war, I mean, we should number them now. I mean, because say it was war 18 of this decade that we just had. I mean, the joke was that NPR is National Pentagon Radio. I mean, the coverage was truly hideous from what I heard. And I had trouble listening to it. It was so bad. I mean, it was coverage that would have been worthy of, you know, Stalin's Radio Moscow in the 1930s. I mean, it was so much the party line. The range of debate was so constricted. And as we now know, much of the factual evidence that's presented as received wisdom has collapsed with people going back to actually see what's going on in these countries. Very little journalism going on. So I'm not real impressed with NPR generally. I think it's vastly overrated. I like some of the NPR local stations, though. I mean, some of them are pretty good. They have good shows. It varies around the country. The local stuff is the best. But, you know, NPR faces the problem that public broadcasting faces in this country, which is they don't get enough financial support to do a good show, so they have to turn to corporate support with all the strings attached that means. But they get enough government support that if they do anything that gets outside the boundaries of the commercial system, they take some chances, you've got some right-winger in Congress threatening to hold hearings the next day to shut you down. And what I think has happened in public broadcasting is that they've internalized these values. Now the people who work there just sort of accept this as okay. They don't even try to make the fight anymore to get Chomsky on. They've given up that fight. They think, why would we want that kook on? It's just they've accepted that they don't want to take any chances. And I think they've drawn in and said, we're just going to be part of the mainstream. And I think it's unfortunate. Yes. Yeah, last question, and if I've missed someone, I'll glad to talk to you afterwards, but I'll take this one.
You mentioned how the lower classes have become exempt from the media's marketing. What long-lasting social effects do you think this will have, like, with the progression away from... Excuse me?
Well, let me repeat it for you. Yeah. The question is, I was talking about how the lower class is not part of the media. Much of the media system bypasses the bottom 20, 30, 40%, depending on the medium of the population. What are the long-term effects of this sort of stratification or polarization? Well, I don't know exactly, but I know they are good. I mean, I guess the argument, they're lucky, they're getting bombarded by lousy shows. I mean, that's one way to look at it. Unfortunately, they're getting bombarded by lousy shows, just not that many. They don't have the same choice. But, I think the whole question of social inequality goes way beyond media. Media is part of it. And, I mean, I think we should all be frightened by the world that we're coming into, especially with the internet, which is making it so easy for people to construct worlds where they can bypass things they don't want to have to deal with. And I think, the number one issue in this country is bypassing upper class people, upper middle class people, bypassing poor people. Now they can basically factor them entirely out of their lives. And I think once that happens, the sort of social policies that we now consider repugnant become much more realistic because they lose a human face. And I'm not going to elaborate on that. I think you might get the drift I'm getting at. But I mean, it's a very bad thing for any notion of community or society I can think of, and I'm very concerned about it.